So it's my honor to help moderate this session, which is, I think, going to be one of the most fun you have all of the last 2 days. And Derek, in his usual fashion, put together a creative and entrepreneurial panel of its own. And he wanted this session to be forward-looking and to say that really recognize the transitions that are upon us as a nation. We've done some incredible work over the last 8 years in outdoor recreation, and there's a whole lot of new opportunities moving forward with a new administration. And as we all know, many times a new administration comes and just changes everything. And our hope is that maybe we can do things differently moving forward to really take some of the great progress over the last 8 years and assess it and see what opportunities remain that are really great and what things we could change. So the way this is going to work, this is in the form of essentially a congressional testimony. We have our three members of Congress in this situation, and then they're going to give about a 5-minute kind of intro on this, and then we're going to invite some witnesses up here. So the way I'm going to give a brief introduction to our panel here, who really needs no introduction, and then I'll just give you a little bit more direction on how this is going to work. So in the center here is Senator Blanch Lincoln, who's, as you know, is the founder and principal of the Lincoln Policy Group. At age 38, she was the youngest woman ever elected to the United States Senate. She made history again when she was the first woman ever to serve as chair of the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. Most of her committee assignments were of deep importance to the people in this room. So I could go on and on about her. Her full bio is in your program, but I'd rather hear from her than just give you her bio. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Blanch Lincoln. And why don't I just run through the intros and then we'll turn it over in this order. To my immediate left is Senator Mark Begich, the President and CEO of the Northern Compass Group. He was a businessman since age 14, which is quite, as someone who studies entrepreneurship, quite impressive, and a public servant for decades. Senator Begich has an impressive record of accomplishment of issues of deep relevance to all of us in this room. Before he was elected to the Senate, Mark Begich was the mayor of Anchorage for 6 years and served on the Anchorage Assembly for 10 years. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Mark Begich. And last but not least, on my far left, is nothing about politics here, is a deep friend of the national parks, is Tom Kiernan, who is now the CEO of the American Wind Energy Association. Before joining AWEA, he was the president of the National Parks Conservation Association for 15 years. Tom also served as Deputy Assistant Administrator at EPA and was former president of the Audubon Society of New Hampshire. Please please join me in welcoming Tom Kiernan. Okay, I'd like to turn the stage over to Senator Lincoln.
Great. Thanks to all of you all for having us. Here we go. Now you can hear me. Much better. Well, thank you all for having us join you. What a wonderful opportunity to visit about something that I know the three of us are very passionate about. I've worked a lot with Mark in the Senate and know Tom's work a great deal from the Audubon Society and a whole host of other things. I think we were together in the other auditorium years ago.
Yeah, we were.
When we were talking about the Lord God bird that was discovered in Arkansas. So that was a great time and one that came to fruition from many stories from my father. But I'm very proud to be with you today to have the discussion about how we move forward, not only with the new administration, but in the 21st century. Of bringing so many Americans who desperately want to experience the wildlife, the wonderful opportunities that exist in our national park system, and the companies and the industries that want to participate in making that great experience happen. So I'm always tempted to talk about my own experiences, and just so you know, as a 7th generation Arkansan, I spent every summer in my formative years in Hot Springs National Park, which is the oldest property in this wonderful country of ours. It was actually invented as a reservation in 1832. So it was long before we had a National Park Service or National Park lands, but obviously it was handed over to the national parks when we did create that and became a national park in 1931, I believe it was. But it was a wonderful experience in both history as well as in health and well-being, not to mention family time, because my dad used to take my two sisters and myself to the bathhouses, and we enjoyed the mineral springs and the hot springs that came out at 143 degrees. And it was just an amazing opportunity to spend time with family, to experience history of what happened when the railroads came through those valleys of Arkansas and things were discovered that the Native Americans had already discovered, and there became a lot of opportunity. So those were great opportunities, as well as the Tetons and a whole host of other things. But that's something that I grew up with. And my husband and I, both being Arkansans, made it a point to ensure that our children have had those same experiences. So the opportunity here is to not only reach out to the generation that's going to and should be experiencing what we have, but it's also reaching out to the older generation who's already had that experience and help them figure out ways to be able to make that transition. As we make a transition here in Washington, with the coming presidential election, keep in mind that those who will be the nominees at our respective conventions will begin the building of their transition teams when they become the nominee. So it's not on election day. They will begin, some of y'all may have seen where Romney's transition papers or documents were released. He actually had a transition team in place. So think about that as you're looking towards what you and your organization and your activities within your relationship with the park system is. I would say from my perspective as well, those that you work with today are very likely going to be some that you work with later on. And I would say that that's a very important tool. Susan, who I had not met before but was very impressed with, who got her award, you know, she's been around. She's been in different places. You will see those people again and again, and it's great to have those kind of relationships. So I know there's going to be more questions about that as we move through the conversations and the questions. As was mentioned, I did serve as chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. So I oversaw the U.S. Forest Service, which is also a great partner. And when I was in the House, I was also a member by design to one of those committees that has kind of lost its legend a little bit, and that's the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee. So I dealt an awful lot with that because I had a tremendous amount of navigable rivers, a lot of waterways, a lot of fisheries, and a whole host of other things. So think about members, too, from states where you know that you work and where you have fond memories of great experiences, because they're more than likely going to seek out committees where new committees perhaps where they'll have some jurisdiction over what's important to them in their state. So I'm not real sure what we were supposed to talk about, but just so you know, in terms of our introduction, I have twin boys that will be 20 this month, and I'm learning a lot. And as much as we have taught them about the outdoors, they love to hunt and to fish, to hike. They adore it all, and they love being in that. They like camping, all of those experiences, but they do it with a device in their hand. And if we don't figure that out, we will have lost an entire generation. So it's just important to remember. So all of us are going through those experiences. I know Mark does too. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here with you, and I hope we'll have a great conversation about all the positive things that we can do working together.
I'd like to now pass it over to Senator Begich.
Thank you very much. I don't want people to be panicked when I walked in and I had this umbrella with me, but I started the day and I thought it was going to rain, and I know the way it works in Washington, D.C. is if you carry the umbrella, it won't rain. And it's very nice outside right now. So let me say thank you for the invitation. Joe, it's good to see you. Thank you for that little extra cheer from the crowd. When I was mayor, we worked with Joe on connecting our local parks with the National Park System and the Forest Service and all the great federal resources that were there. And it was a great partnership, and I'll actually mention a couple thoughts on that in a few seconds here. But again, good to see you, Joe. And I could tell when they said they're going to take a break, I looked in this audience and said, who's going to give the moment while the break is going on? And of course, Joe just stood right up and did what he does best. It's interesting when Blanch was talking about her experiences. I grew up in a family of 6. There was 5 brothers and sisters, and every summer we would leave Alaska and go to Minnesota where my parents' relatives were. So we all piled into the station wagon. This was the days where seatbelts were a luxury, and you were kind of in the back, imagine 6 kids in a station wagon. And it was to experience not only the trip, to drive to Minnesota to see our cousins and everything, but also it was to visit so many of the national park systems, state park systems, everything that was out there. It didn't matter if it was Yellowstone, Mount Rushmore, Painted Desert, Grand Canyon, Redwood Forest, you name it, we had probably gone to it in some form or another. So as Blanch said, we're the next generation, my son, who's now going on to 14, I say this sarcastically, I'm torturing him with the same experience, but that is he does not have to stay in a station wagon. But we do drive, and he's enjoying every moment of these parks. I remember when we were coming from Alaska to D.C. my first year when I was in the Senate, we drove, took 17 days. We only spent 300 miles a day on the road, and then we would find a place. And we would use our apps and so forth to find a location. I remember we brought camping gear and camped out in Yellowstone. And of course, coming from Alaska, it wasn't unusual for us to camp out, but our camping is a little more rustic than what we were used to around us. But it was a great experience for my son and for me, and it just reminded me once again the value of these incredible, and I call them assets of the country, and what we need to be doing. When you think about, I forget who said the commentary, one of the award winners, about Yellowstone and now the traffic jams that are occurring, the capacity. That makes sense when you think about it. It makes a lot of sense. When I was in the Senate, the economy was crashing and we were struggling to try to figure out how to rebuild the economy. One of the first things we knew was where we would see immediate response to a better economy was going to be in our national park systems, our state park systems. And why? Because it was inexpensive to get to. You could do it with a little bit of money, a little bit of time, and you had great experiences. Well, of course, the economy is a lot better than ever before in the last 6 years, and now you're feeling that by the park system being overcrowded. Along with that, to be very frank with you, the national or international situation of travel is a little more different than a decade ago. People are more apt to stay closer to home, which means they want to experience unique experiences around the country. When you think of Alaska as one example, we're going to have a record year of tourism, a record year of visitors. Which is just an amazing statement for us. It's a couple million people come visit us on a regular basis. They travel all throughout the state. When you think of the National Park Service, which again also, my understanding, will have a record-setting visitations based on already their early bookings and what's going to happen this summer. But then you look at the startling statistic, which, this is one I don't have to preach to this group here, and it's grown every year, and longer it takes, the more expensive it gets. There's over $12 billion in backlog maintenance and infrastructure improvements in our national park system. If you added the state park systems, then you add the local, because they all are complementary. Most visitors who come to a state don't necessarily know when a borderline switches from a state park to a federal park, but they know they're enjoying it. And the backlog of these maintenance and repairs are increasing at a dramatic pace, which is probably going to be the biggest challenge, I believe, when you think of your organizations, people like us that care about these issues, and the new administration. It's a small amount in the big picture when you think about it. I mean, just last year, Congress approved a tax extender bill worth $800 billion, and they never paid for it. Not one penny paid for it. But I guarantee you, when they talk about $12 billion for the park system, the first words out of their mouth will be, how are you going to pay for it? But they had no problem in paying for tax benefits for thoroughbred horse racing and NASCAR, and I can go through the list, which they have no pay for. So this will be the challenge, to show the value of our park system. And all you have to do is go back to the time when the government shut down. And I remember one of the most, by demographics, one of the most conservative states had a little situation. Well, what did they have? They had the park closed, and guess what happened to all the businesses in front of the park? All went down. And so what they do, they got the most conservative elements of Congress to support reopening. Why? Because it was good business. You know, I used to be in the real estate business. The one thing I always loved is showing a property that was near a park, near a river, near public access, near public infrastructure. That added value and added unique opportunity for whatever was going to happen there, maybe a home or a business. I think when you think about maintenance investment and long-term investment that has to be done, we do have to think of a different way. It can't just be going to Congress and say, where's the money, solve this problem. That is not going to be the case, because literally last year, annual deficit of the federal government, $380 billion, give or take, down from $1.2 trillion in 2009. Probably this next year, it's going to be up into $600 to $700 billion again. It's going the wrong direction, so it makes it even harder to get money. So we have to think of creative ways. When I was mayor of Anchorage, we thought of all kinds. We partnered with people. We got foundations involved. I remember one event, I'll never forget this. It was, we had some money to do creek restoration. It was kind of a vague title. It was drainage rehabilitation, but creek restoration. And we wanted to build some ASUs that gave some better landings, because people were standing on the banks and eroding the banks and crushing this downtown stream called Ship Creek in Anchorage, which was a beautiful creek that had king salmon you could fish on it, but it was crumbling. So we created a partnership. And when I remember doing the press conference, at a table just like this, I was in the center, the Sierra Club was here, and the Chamber of Commerce was here. But we were all together for one simple purpose: to support the rehabilitation of that creek, for the fisheries, for the environment, for the business, for the environment, for the whole community. It was a win all the way around. So you have to think of these things in a much different way than I think we have in the past. When I left the city, we created a Parks Foundation, which has generated over $30 million for our local parks, between foundations, grants, kind of this combination of efforts. And the best part, the way we designed it, I was just interviewed on this a couple days ago. Usually those foundations, when a mayor's involved, they always have their appointees and their elected officials and all this stuff. But I did it in a way that was very different. I created a 501c3. The mayor at that time, I appointed the first board, but then it came perpetual. So what did that do? All the money that came into it, the politicians couldn't touch it. Even when we had some fiscal issues, usually the first thing that gets cut, parks, cultural, those kinds of things. So we insulated it. We did the same thing with the museum. We did the same thing with the library. When you think of things that people cut in tough times, those are usually the three. But when you think of a great city, a great state, a great country, those are three things you want to preserve, because they build and keep history. They show the future. They look at the past. It's an amazing part of the equation. So we have to think of things a lot differently in how we engage the private sector. I think the parks need a lot more champions from the business community, not just in a time of crisis when the budgets get cut or shut down, the budgets or the governments get shut down, but actually using them as great advocates. And the last thing I'll say, and I'm like Blanch, I'm anxious to see kind of our next role here, but one of the things I would highly suggest, and I know this is done, but it's not as publicized as it could be, I think, in a lot of ways, because as a public policymaker for over 22 years, in elected office, I saw it once in a while, and that is the economic value, not presented by park folks, but by business folks. Usually what happens is, when a report is done, the parks community who support parks, or local and state and federal parks, are the ones who present it. The reverse should happen. The people who benefit from it should present it. and that's the business community. Because without these great assets in this country, I can tell you a huge economic piece of this equation will disappear. And when you think of people who visit this country from all around the world, they don't just say, well, geez, I'm just going to go and visit the subway. They don't come and say, geez, I'm going to go visit a Safeway. They go because of the national assets we have, the beautiful assets we have. May they be incredible monuments, to open space, to parks. That's what they come for. And if we're thinking about a long-term economic benefit for this country, this $12 billion investment is pennies when you think about what it can return long-term. So I'm glad you're thinking about the future, the next administration. There's a lot of effort that has to be done to educate that next group, whoever they are, and making sure they understand the economic value. Thank you.
Thank you. Kiernan.
Great, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm not sure if I'm honored or confused being with these two extraordinary leaders, but I'm happy to join and at least share a few framing remarks to get going. Let me preface my remarks with the thought as I sit back, and while I'm not officially in the outdoor recreation community, goodness knows I care deeply and spend a lot of personal time out there, these do seem to be uniquely challenging times in regards to public lands and outdoor recreation. We've obviously have a number of strongly held, diverse viewpoints out there, whether you go to the Oregon standoff, whether you go to state versus federal, should we sell off the federal lands or not? When you go to the question of energy development or access, impact of climate change or not on all of our public lands, these are, politely put, richly debated these days, and it is thus, in my view, extraordinarily important that Partner Outdoors, at your meeting here, that you're thinking through a vision, a plan, a strategy to work with the campaigns, both presidential, Senate, House, et cetera, because I would suggest the country needs to come together around a more shared strategy and vision and set of proposals to move ahead on public lands, because there are a lot of views out there, and I think we need to craft a way forward. So that's the preface that I wanted to share. I did have two specific process suggestions and one substantive one, and they very much build off of your two comments. First, as was mentioned over the break, it is so very important to be in dialogue now with the presidential campaigns, with the paid staffs, with their volunteer teams, with their fundraising teams, or whomever. Obviously, they're thinking about it, whether it's Secretary Clinton's plan that came out yesterday or the day before, whether it was Mr. Trump's plan on energy development that came out Friday. I mean, they are releasing plans, and as we all are seeing, they're debating it back and forth on Twitter. They're going back and forth every 10 minutes. We need to make sure that both of those campaigns have our collective vision, thoughts, proposals, and that as they're, if you will, dialoguing back and forth on Twitter, that you are involved in those debates here and now, tweeting or putting out press releases or inserting facts, helping to frame the debate that's occurring among the candidates as we speak. So that's one thought. This is not, and I think people get this, you don't wait for the president to get into office. Those agendas are getting framed now, and you need to be part of that dialogue. That's one thought. Second thought, I would not ignore, and I imagine you're not, the Senate races, House races, state legislatures. In the wind industry, in the energy field, clearly a lot matters at the state legislatures, and you need to be out there in those debates, who controls the Senate, who the leadership will be, etc. Hugely important. I do understand that, for example, committees on the Republican side in the Senate are starting to plan what they're going to do, presuming they maintain control of the Senate. On the Democratic side, committee staffs are thinking about, well, what are we going to do if we take control? You need to be in dialogue with them now to help frame their agendas going forward, presuming one or the other outcome of control of the Senate. So while there's so much good discussion at the presidential level, clearly the Senate, House, et cetera, we collectively in the outdoor industry need to be putting forward visions, plans, strategies, proposals to all of those audiences. And then those were my two process points. The last point I wanted to share, and it does build off of your comments on the national parks, a soft spot in my heart. Clearly, this being the centennial year, the administration has a number of great initiatives going forward, whether it's the Kids in the Parks and other efforts. Obviously up on the Hill, Chairman Bishop and others have legislation they're looking at and moving on the centennial. Those are great efforts. As I sit back and look at it, the amount of attention, the press, the movies that are out there about the national parks, I wonder whether the result of this centennial year for the national parks is actually not getting to the solution, in other words, fixing the problem with the backlog or with making sure parks are relevant to the younger generation. We may not be this year finding the solution to those problems. The result of this centennial year may be educating the American public about where we are with the parks, that there are some real challenges, and starting to frame the issue so that next Congress, next president, there's a high probability of taking several big steps forward in addressing some of the challenges. So it's the centennial of the year of the national parks. We may not solve all or many of the problems. We may educate the American public and start framing up solutions that get solved in the next Congress or the one after that. That may actually be the result, the real result of this centennial year, is getting the American public aware of and concerned about and motivated to address the challenges that our national parks face. And if that's the case, coming up with plans and proposals now and getting them to the campaigns is that much more important. So those were some initial thoughts to hopefully frame up a coming discussion.
Terrific. Thank you very much to the panel. Now I'd like to invite up our three witnesses that will each have about 5 minutes or 5 moments, depending upon how you count, of testimony to this committee. And then you will ask them questions, and then we'll open it up to the room if we have time. So I would like to invite up somebody who's been on stage a number of times, Todd Davidson, who is the CEO of Travel Oregon and the National Chair of the United States Travel Association. He's going to speak on the role of parks and the great outdoors in stimulating our national economy. Then I'd also like to invite up Kevin Coyle, who is the Vice President of Education for the National Wildlife Federation. He's going to highlight the role of education and the outdoors and the ways that we can enhance our nation's education system by bringing our children outdoors. And finally, I'd like to introduce and invite up Dr. Robert Zarr, who is the Park Prescriptions Advisor for the National Park Service, and he's going to be talking about the role of outdoors and our health. And I'd like to ask Mr. Davidson to begin the testimony and address our committee here.
Well, this will be a little different since I'm used to having the committee sit here. But so if you'll indulge me, I'll kind of work back and forth.
And we won't interrupt. We won't do what they do in Senate committees. Pound on the table.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the committee's invitation to present before you today very much. Suffice to say, and as a means of context, the travel and tourism industry has become a primary driver of the U.S. economy. It is now generating $2.1 trillion annually. It's supporting 15 million jobs. In fact, 1 in 9 Americans owe their jobs to visitors that are traveling this country, spending dollars, euros, yen, and other currency as they do. The growth in international visitation in particular is helping buoy the U.S. economy. While all other U.S. goods and services declined for the 5th time based on a report that was just issued in March of this year, the analysis also showed that travel exports bucked that downward trend in March and increased for the 5th time in 6 months, even reaching their highest level, $18.7 billion, highest level since May of 2014. This news actually comes against a backdrop of a $1.5 billion decline in overall exports. The report is obviously a good sign for the travel industry and for Americans' economy because spending by international visitors is now rising. Travel goods and services now account for 10% of total U.S. exports during the first quarter of 2016. This is a growth of 1% over where we were in 2015, and by contrast, all other exports of U.S. goods and services declined by 6% in the first quarter of this year. Awareness of the role of the travel and tourism industry is high amongst members of Congress and amongst this administration. the passage of the Travel Promotion Act in 2009 that was signed into law by President Obama in 2010 was also then put in place for 5 years. It was reauthorized a year early because of the success that Brand USA was accomplishing in driving demand for international visitation to the United States. President Obama issued an executive order calling for the establishment of a national travel and tourism strategy for the first time ever. And that also gave, I would say, wings to the Tourism Policy Council, where now we're seeing secretaries and undersecretaries sitting around the table from numerous federal agencies that are engaged in the travel and tourism industry in some respect. Folks from Interior to Agriculture to the Commerce Department and others that are sitting around the table looking for ways to solve the challenges that are facing the U.S. travel and tourism industry. The recreation is also a key component of the National Travel and Tourism Strategy and the travel industry in general. The Outdoor Foundation estimates that 142 million Americans went on 12.1 billion outdoor outings in 2014. The Outdoor Industry Association went on to say that those outings resulted in $646 billion in spending and supported over 6 million jobs in the U.S. economy. So moving forward, I have 4 requests, suggestions, yearnings that I would probably put in front of you as a committee. One is, it's going to be very important, and several of you mentioned the transition that we're facing in administrations. Regardless of party affiliation, there will be a transition that occurs in administration. It's going to be important that we maintain the focus on the National Travel and Tourism Strategy. It has proven to be a bipartisan job creator. These are jobs for the U.S. economy that cannot be outsourced. Travel benefits the entire nation, and it also impacts broader aspects of our economy than just the direct spending that occurs with the travel and tourism industry alone. Senator Lincoln, you mentioned some of the other aspects, and what came to mind for me immediately was how a study we did in Oregon actually showed that when visitors came to Oregon, they went home changed. They went home just a little bit more, as I say, Oregonian in their behavior, as I'm sure they did when they returned home from Arkansas or from Alaska, Senator Begich. The fact is this: their consumer behavior changed as a result of where they chose to take their vacations. We found increases in Oregon craft beer sales, Oregon wine sales, and other agricultural products because they came to Oregon, were introduced to those products while they were in Oregon on their vacation. And as a result, travel and tourism wasn't just that direct economic impact, it also was driving spending in other segments of our economy as well. My second request going forward is to keep recreation a priority for our federal agencies. Streamlining the special use permitting process, online permits. I mean, the fact that permits cannot be filled out, not all permits can be filled out online. The permits cannot be tracked by these outfitter guides so they know where they are in the process. If the outfitter guides are providing services on multiple different jurisdictions, they may have to fill out the same form numerous times, same fields, but the fields don't carry over from form to form. Being able to track online the user day activity so that they're not having to send folks down to a district office to wait until the doors open at 8 o'clock to find out if they might be able to put some folks on a particular river or trail 2 or 3 days from now when they know the permits are going to be opening up because we haven't moved that process online yet. Simplifying the fee process, using credit cards, allowing people to make advance payments, having greater interagency and intergovernmental fees, at the state, local, and the federal level as well. My third request is this: unleashing the power of technology to enhance the visitor's experience. We've talked about this a lot. I remember over 15 years ago coming to a meeting here in DC that was to deal with what was called Recreation One Stop. And it gave rise to what is now recreation.gov, and Rick DeLapp and the team on rec.gov are doing a fabulous, fabulous job. What we still lack, though, is a comprehensive, robust database of every recreation site that is within the federal purview. And the reason that matters is this: I, as a state tourism office, could take the data that is Oregon-specific and help visitors use that information to then build their itineraries and their trips in Oregon. The private sector could take that information and put together apps on where to go kayaking, or where to go hiking, or where to go camping, where to go RVing, whatever it may be. But the private sector can then harness that data for what they do and do very, very well. Using data for international translations. It can be very time-consuming and labor-intensive, but to use technology to be able to provide those services. And also, as Senator Lincoln mentioned, you know, your 20-year-old sons may be traveling now with their devices, and unless we really unlock how they can utilize those, you know, sometimes I find a resistance to technology because it's like, well, we don't want people coming to our national parks and gaming. I assure you, your 20-year-old sons are not looking to go to Yellowstone to game. But that's how they share information. That's how they communicate with their friends. And so to be able to put in Wi-Fi hotspots and the like so that when folks are taking those photographs, I mean, you remember the day where it used to be Kodak would sponsor the places that you could take pictures, right? You know, I'm going back to when I was a kid in the back of the family station wagon bouncing around with no seatbelts. But that's where we are. That's where we are today. You know, and so that we need to harness technology because this is the way the millennials are communicating with one another and not have this pent-up resistance to incorporating technology, Wi-Fi, et cetera, into what we're doing. My final request is this, to tap the U.S. travel and tourism industry to aid in getting the recreation message out. You've got businesses and gateway communities that are hungry to partner with their federal agencies. This is where the transactions are occurring and the jobs are created. There's opportunities to look at grants, maybe through the recreational fee program, to aid in the development of product as well as co-op marketing programs. And as I mentioned, when that data is available, the gateway community businesses can utilize it, state tourism offices, local convention and visitor bureaus, and our own Brand USA, who's marketing America to the world, could access that same data to let our international guests know where they can go to recreate throughout the United States. The bottom line is this. There's a $2.1 trillion national travel and tourism industry that's ready to aid in the advancement of the recreation sector's role in the U.S. economy. You only need to tap into its potential. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Kevin Coyle from the National Wildlife Federation to talk about the role of education in the great outdoors and the opportunities for time in the great outdoors to improve our nation's education system.
And I have the great honor of talking through Todd's head to the panel. So I'm probably going to aim out. At the National Wildlife Federation, we spend a lot of time looking in the future, and in particular, looking at whether anybody's going to give a darn about parks in the future. And I think you all know the statistics about youth and their connection. And it's hard to have this conversation, frankly, with the converted because they so believe that everybody's like them. But in the real world out there, there's a problem. And the problem is the kids aren't really getting out that much anymore. The numbers are shrinking all the time. The amount and quality of the outdoor experience is shrinking all the time. And so at the Wildlife Federation, we've given up on a certain idea, that is that parents will be a big player in getting kids outside to play. They may take them to a national park, but they're not necessarily going to get them out on a regular basis to play. If you dig into the research a little bit, you find something that is very challenging, and that is that what truly connects people to nature, kind of long-term, really committed, is actually a regular experience in nature. It's not the incidental once-a-year visit to the parks or visit to the national forest. It's the ongoing experience. And nature has to be, can be local, but it's got to be in nature, it's got to be about nature, it's got to have some kind of social benefit for the child. It's got to come with rewards. The child has to be learning skills, things like that. So at the Wildlife Federation, we began to focus on what we call child-serving institutions. If you really want a term that turns people off, pick that one. And in particular, we've begun to look at opportunities that exist in the realm of education and in the realm of public education in particular. So I just want to rattle these off. Todd had 4 requests. I have 6. Let me kind of talk about them a little bit. But the basic idea here is to lay a groundwork on a daily basis, on a weekly basis with children, so that when they are ready to love the parks, when they're ready to really care about outdoor recreation, It will be something that's deep inside them. It's not something that they're going to have to append later in life. That's the sort of core idea. So recommendation number one is to support and expand the green schools movement in this country. And when I say green schools, let's say hypothetically you're in the energy business, you might think of energy audits and recycling programs and things like that, reducing carbon footprint. But green schools really, in most of the schools around the country, translates to tree planting, school gardens, outdoor spaces, outdoor classrooms, trails, those kinds of things. And school garden movement in this country is quite large. When schools are green in the vegetative sense, the kids have higher cognition. They're actually smarter. There's enough study now that shows that their IQ goes up. Kids sleep better because their sleep cycles are improved. Therefore, they're better students. Grades and graduation improve. There's all kinds of health. We're going to hear later about health benefits. Attention spans improve. These are all really valuable things for the kids. So guess what? This really sells with public officials. Green schools can save energy money. They can improve the overall ability of kids to learn. Often you'll find the schools that are in the deepest trouble, urban schools, really down and out, will actually take an environmental education program and a green school program and use it as the tool to turn themselves around. So there's a tremendous promise here and billions of dollars to be saved in our $600 billion K-12 public education budget. The second thing that I would recommend is actually to enlarge environmental education in federal and state policy, and that's actually something that's never been easier to do, as odd as it sounds. The reason is that the Republican Congress just last year passed something called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which you probably all knew as the No Child Left Behind legislation. And in that, for the first time, there is language in several key provisions that supports environmental education and field study. That's new. And guess what? It provides access to environmental education to $3 billion in funding. One of the things, the recommendations we have for the future is actually to fund it and to have the money come through. So that's a tremendous opportunity, and this country is starving for good scientists and for people who care about science. And this legislation and the environment working together can actually help to create more scientists in this country, strong scientists who know how to be scientists as opposed to understanding merely the concepts of science. The third thing I would say is that we looked at something really interesting about after school. And if you pay attention to education in general, after-school programs are interesting because they sort of take care of these kids in the hours from 3 to 6, which, by the way, is when they get in the most trouble. And we found something interesting. The Y and park and recreation agencies are the major providers in the United States of after-school programming. So we thought, this is great. They're going to get lots of nature, right? Wrong. So park and recreation agencies, when they began to look at their after-school program, they're all indoor programs. They're sports, basketball, table tennis, they're indoor programs. So one of the real opportunities that could affect 10 million kids is to actually get nature programs built into after school and to figure out various ways to incentivize that. There's a similar opportunity in preschool. If you go to your average daycare center, they don't really have any kind of nature programs for kids. There's some, the really nice ones have them. So in the state of Texas, they actually took this on as an issue. And guess who in the state agencies took it on? Wasn't Texas Parks and Wildlife, wasn't the Forestry Department, it was the Workforce Commission. So the Workforce Commission said, you know what, we want high-quality daycare centers because that keeps people off of welfare. It's a really interesting kind of interplay of public policy. And so what happened was they incentivized daycare centers to start having outdoor education programs because the kids end up healthier and the kids end up smarter. And now 1,000 daycare centers in Texas have this kind of outdoor programming and outdoor landscaping and so forth that's going to really help them. And then two other areas I would focus on, and youth development. And youth development, we're at a place now where careers are going to be really important. And thinking about outdoor careers in a traditional sense has to go beyond where we are. So this is very relevant to the public land managing agencies, state level, local level, and the federal level. And that is, there's going to be a tremendous need in our society for knowledge and sophistication about natural resource management, all kinds of natural resource management, forest ecology, fire ecology, shoreline softening, all kinds of things that have to do with resiliency and climate resiliency in particular. And that there are, again, major opportunities in this country to expand the core network to a much larger scale, to have career and technical education at the high school level with much more natural resource focus, and to look at community colleges and to put those together in a package that really creates a core of career development. And then the final thing that I would say is that the nexus between local experiences for kids, the kind of experiences that they would have at school, and the experiences that they would have in a national park, we need to do a lot more work on figuring out how to bridge that difference. We talk about buses and taking kids from the inner city out to a park or out to an area, but we need to think creatively at lots of different levels. Earlier there was a mention of technology and the role of technology. Good idea. Let's figure out how to create a linkage, a bridge between the local experience and that national experience. And so when you go through what are possible, we need more curriculum. We need curriculum about public lands and national lands and so forth. We may not need new curriculum, but we need to get it into schools. We need to figure out better ways to get it into schools, and there's more opportunity for that now. We need really to look at how we can get some of those public lands to the schools. The Wildlife Federation did a project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service where we actually created habitats at the schools that reflected the ecosystems of nearby wildlife refuges. It doesn't sound too pure, but it was interesting, and it created a situation where the kids actually developed a knowledge of that local ecosystem at the refuge, and they wanted to go there. It was a very different experience because it made it real for them. So I will say that there are many opportunities. There's a lot of work to be done to create these bridges. Schools are not the only place. Daycare centers are not the only place. After-school programs are not the only place. Park agencies, local park agencies, all of these somehow or another have to be brought together with the federal estate to create a long-standing bond, because we're in a situation where kids are losing touch with nature. We've got to turn that around, and we've got to reach to where they live and make it happen there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Dr. Robert Zarr to spend some time addressing the committee on the role of the great outdoors and health.
Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to give some testimony about a program that is very dear to my heart. I'm a pediatrician right here in the district. I practice 5 days a week. Continue to do that as I also parallel that work being the National Park Prescription Advisor to the National Park Service. So I'm here to talk about Park RX, which is actually Park Prescription, and in a way that I hope will illustrate some of the points that were mentioned earlier. And my comments really are going to be in the context of how we can combat this epidemic of chronic disease through nature. Next slide. So before I get into what Park RX is and how it fits into this big picture here, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't take some time to talk about this chronic disease epidemic. 1 in 3 Americans is currently suffering from at least one or more chronic disease right now. This is the modern day scourge. We sit, we rarely go outside. Between 87 to 95% of our time, both awake and asleep, is spent indoors. These are things like high blood pressure, diabetes, overweight, a slew of mental health problems from depression, anxiety, ADHD, on and on. These are the things that are actually causing us to suffer and to die prematurely. Next slide. If you want to know numbers, here are the numbers. So millions are suffering from serious mental illness, millions suffering from obesity, millions suffering from diabetes, high blood pressure. And if you're interested in saving dollars, and you mentioned that earlier, healthcare expenditures is a great way to save money. So right now we're spending about $3.2 trillion on healthcare expenditures. And about 86% of that dollar is actually spent on managing chronic disease. Now, I'm a pediatrician, and you'd be surprised what I do every day. Yes, I do the common colds and the vaccines and all that, but on top of that, it's in the context of chronic disease. Kids now have prediabetes. I see kids on a daily basis with A1C levels of 7%, 5.9%. So it is now a reality. We're not talking the next 5-10 years. It is happening now. Next slide. This slide is actually not here as a breather, although you may see it as that. This slide actually has a real effect on you. It lowers your cortisol, it lowers your pulse, it might even lower your blood pressure. Next slide. And so this segues into the mental health effects, right? We know that looking at nature or being in nature doesn't necessarily mean being active in nature, which is a good thing too, but literally just being in nature or looking at nature, it decreases your anxiety, decreases your negative thoughts. It actually, in children, there's a great study out of UIL with Dr. Francis Coyle, two groups of kids, both with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One group got Ritalin, one group did not. One group got unstructured play in a natural setting. Well, when I grew up, we didn't call it that, but you just went outside and played. And it turned out that 6 hours later, right, which is sort of 4 to 6 hours later, which is the maximum effect of Ritalin or a stimulant medication, they looked at the symptoms of both groups, and guess who fared better? The group of kids who actually went outdoors. I'm not suggesting we stop giving our kids Ritalin. I'm suggesting that we think a little bit about how our kids spend their day. If they talk at a turn, if they move out of their seat, they're told, go see your pediatrician and get some Ritalin. And I'm not exaggerating, this happens every day. Next slide. It's not just about mental health. You know, we know that it has an effect, as I mentioned earlier, on reducing your cortisol levels. So there are forest bathing groups in Japan, buses of Japanese who are taken to the forest, and they monitor their cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It goes down. They monitor blood pressure. It goes down. We know that people who live close to a park or near a park, have access to a park, have less anxiety. We know they have less chance of developing type 2 diabetes. We know that overall mortality is reduced simply by being in or near nature. And back to the money figure here, there was a study in 2004 in Nebraska that actually measured cost savings, which is kind of interesting here. So for every dollar spent on building and maintaining bicycle and pedestrian trails, you save $3 on healthcare expenditures. Next slide. So I'm almost at ParkRx. I want to talk a little bit about Healthy Park, Healthy People, which is a program out of the National Park Service. There's actually an Office of Public Health within the National Park Service that is there for very good, obvious reasons. And Healthy Park, Healthy People has sort of 5 areas to it, one of which is creating partnerships. And that's where ParkRx or Park Prescription falls. Partnerships between parks, partnerships between land and water agencies, and the health provider world. This isn't about just doctors. You can think broadly, psychiatrists, podiatrists, therapists, on and on, people who are providing care. If I wince, by the way, it's because I have a ruptured Baker's cyst in my right knee, and I just saw a physical therapist about 2 hours ago. So even physical therapists prescribe time in outdoor settings for their patients, and I talked about that with her as she worked on my knee. Next slide. So we all know that if you have a national website, you've made it. You're real, you exist. Okay, I'm just a joke. We actually do have a national website. It went live about 2 months ago. And if you want to see more information about ParkRx, there's a brilliant, I think, list of resources there to help you understand all the programs around the country we have already, and what it means, why it's relevant to the health provider community, and why it's easy to use. Next slide. So I'm going to dive into an area I know best, which is DC ParkRx, which I have founded and been directing for the last almost 6 years now. And it's simply a community health initiative whose goal is to promote well-being, wellness, prevent and treat chronic disease. Wow, that's huge, right? That's a lot we're trying to do here. But remember, we have a national epidemic, and it really spans the spectrum of all the kinds of disease, mental and otherwise, that we are suffering from. Next slide. I didn't do it alone. A lot of partners involved, both local and nationally. Next slide. What have we done so far? We've mapped and we've rated the green space in DC. We are now adding parks in our regional counties, in Montgomery County and Prince George's County. We'll reach Arlington, Fairfax very soon. So we're building this database of parks that then we take, make it electronic, and we link it to the electronic health record. We went live in July 1st of 2013. It's now not just where I work, which is Unity Healthcare. Now we have CCI, which is a federally qualified health center in Southern Maryland. We have Children's National Medical Center involved in this, also prescribing. So when you add it all up, this is now not just a DC thing, but it's a regional thing. Soon I hope to be a Mid-Atlantic thing. Soon I hope to be a national thing, where we are literally prescribing nature to a region that contains about 200,000 patients and about 300 providers. It's a pretty substantial group now. Next slide. So usually I talk to some doctors as well in the crowd. I think I'm probably one of the few here today. Woe is me. 3 clicks away. When you're in my world, if it's not easy to use in the electronic health record, you're not going to use it. So 3 clicks I've got it down to in where I work at Unity Healthcare. It's down to 1 click, actually, at the other 2 large provider groups. They literally just type in .parkrx and it links up. So let's go 1, 2, 3 on those slides. This is what it would look like if you're inside my patient's electronic health record. Very quickly, let's go through these. Another one, and there you are. So 1, 2, 3, you're now inside the database. You put in a zip code, a landmark, an address, and then you press search, and you get parks down there. I can't read it from here because I'm getting a little bit older now, but usually it's about 20 or 30 parks on the bottom right-hand corner. Next slide. But that's not enough, right? We found out that you have to be able to match the park, the best park or the best 2 parks to the person, in this case, your patient. And so we can filter it now. And when you filter it, let's say if somebody wants to play, and this isn't just for kids anymore, by the way, this is for everyone. We all need to be outside more, and kids need to see good behavior modeled by their parents and grandparents and family, et cetera. So we do this all ages, all specialties in many places around the country and certainly here in our region. And you can match it to activities. Let's say they want to play baseball, basketball, golf. There's actually a park here in DC. We can go horseback riding, whatever it is that suits your fancy, for whatever time is suitable for you in your schedule and your willingness to do it. And then next slide, there you go, voila. You have a park page. A park page is a summary of a park. We have now 354 parks and adding to our park database. So you can imagine this incredible resource that's in general underutilized because of our daily routines of not being outside. And the patient can then either be texted this eventually, emailed this, printed, and have this as a tool as part of the prescription for them to actually go outside and use a park, but in the form of a prescription. So I would never tell you, you know what, Senator, I'm sorry, you have a pneumonia, and I want you to go to the pharmacy, take the antibiotic, whatever antibiotic you like to take it as long as you want, with or without food, and I'll see you whenever. I don't do that. So, and no one really does that. So we're doing the same thing with parks now. We have specificity. We want to make sure that it's a tool people can use, it's relevant to their practice, and it's specific. And now we have done all of those 3 things. Next slide. So next step, this is my last slide. So I would challenge everybody in this room to think about ways in which we can expand this nationally. We're doing it regionally already. But how do we do this nationally? Where do we think about this from a public health perspective? Where are the most vulnerable populations who need the most to use parks? Now we know people living in low-income families, people of color, are the least likely to use green space. Oh, and by the way, they're the most likely to suffer from premature mortality and chronic disease. So it's really, the onus is on us for a number of reasons, but certainly I would posit that we could probably save billions of dollars when we do the analysis in healthcare expenditures by simply connecting our patients to parks. The second is we need to use technology. You know, I'm not a Luddite. I'm actually a sort of a technophile. I carry my phone like everybody else. When I first started practicing 15 years ago, I thought, and I only see low income, that nobody was going to have one of these in the office. I was the only one who didn't have one. I was a late adopter, and that's true. The data shows that actually the low income were the fastest users and adopters of this technology. So my patients actually have these smartphones, and they use them. The question is, how do we use this technology to help us both prevent and treat chronic disease by prescribing PARCs? And we're working on that now. And then the third thing is, we can never forget to think about evaluating and researching the work that we do. At the end of the day, we need to know that the science truly supports this. I need to know whether my patients' blood pressures and A1Cs and BMIs actually improve over time. And we are also thinking about that locally and nationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you.
Wow. That's some really compelling testimony. And now I'd like to turn it back to our committee members here to comment and perhaps ask some questions of our experts, particularly with the goal of getting some unity or unified recommendations that could be delivered to the transition teams on the value of recreation going forward. Would you like to start, Senator Lincoln? Turn on your microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Zarr. There. Thank you, Dr. Zarr. My husband is a physician as well, and quite the outdoorsman, and would be really hooraying right now. But I also wanted to visit with Kevin. You know, Kevin, I think you're exactly right. I come from a 7th-generation Arkansas farm family, and I learned my love of the outdoors through my father and my mother. Our big fancy Sunday lunches after church were on a picnic blanket close to the farm where my dad was working in the afternoons. And, you know, we learned to love the outdoors, duck hunting and other activities, fishing particularly. My children were 2 when I came to the United States Senate, and in order to participate in their lives, I brought them with me. And our 2 things we wanted were good schools and close commute time so we could spend time with our family. Fortuitously, we ended up in North Arlington, where there's a tremendous amount of parks. We have at least 300 acres right out our door in terms of parks for trails and walking and gardening with master gardeners and all those kind of things. The other great thing is that the school system in Northern Virginia, back in the late 60s, or maybe, yeah, it was about the 60s, purchased about 250 acres out by Dulles Airport, which is now Dulles, it wasn't then, called the Outdoor Learning Center. And each child in the Northern Virginia elementary school system in the 3rd grade spends a half a day at the Outdoor Center. In the 4th grade, they spend a full day at the Outdoor Center. And in the 5th grade, they do a full day and an overnight. And it is amazing what it does for those kids to be able not only to enjoy the outdoors and to learn about it, but they teach. They teach physics out there. They have fulcrums and levers and pulleys, and they move trees with boards and get dirty and not afraid of the dirt and the camping and those kind of things. And so Mark and I were sitting here visiting about how important it is to really partner with schools and school districts, local communities and others to really provide the opportunity for kids to enjoy, because sometimes parents, particularly in low-income situations, are working 2 jobs. They may not get that exposure or that experience without integrating it with schools. And that's going to be a tall order, because having worked, whether it was No Child Left Behind, the 3 R's, any of those different education programs, the schools then have to go through their state board of education for accreditation and other things, and fitting it into a schedule is hard. So a lot of what you've presented, I think, is very, very helpful. And I would recommend that people look at ways that they can partner with their local schools, school districts, state board of educations, and others to really help create. I know after the experience we had, I went to Arkansas and really worked with partnering to see what kind of outdoor laboratories we could help create. So I would just encourage that. But I think it was a wonderful, wonderful thought, because kids just need exposure. They really, really do. They need to experiment. They need to experiment with the outdoors, and they're not always going to get that, unfortunately, at home.
One thing I would add to that The Wildlife Federation has a couple of green school programs, and we now have, we're active in over 9,000 schools. Do you know what the racial makeup is of those 9,000 schools? 50% kids of color. So part of the future is not just, connecting these young people in their hearts and their minds to nature, but it's also recognizing how important it's going to be to have a park and forest and wildlife conservation movement that's reflective of American society, and that's going to be really important. So,
Well, Arlington itself, when they redesigned the whole county, they designed it so that no home, hopefully, would be further than 1.5 miles from a library or a park. And so when they began to take tax delinquent lands and others, it didn't have to be a huge park, but it was a small park. And again, working with folks who can design programs and the opportunities and the industry out there that supports our parks. I mean, looking at those new ways of how they can integrate with county governments and city governments and others. New Orleans, after Katrina, I went down and worked with them some to talk about how they could create more green space, how they could create more opportunities for children and schools and other things like that. So turning some of those unfortunate circumstances into building tools is a great opportunity out there too.
Terrific. I'd like to turn it over to Senator Begich for some comments or questions.
Just a couple quick comments and a question. You all mentioned technology, which I thought was interesting in some form or another, some significantly, from agency use to individual use, kind of this combination, which seems to be the biggest challenge, or at least opportunity sitting out there. The statistics that I've seen, and maybe these are old, but you just maybe think about it with the schools you're in, but how do we increase, and anyone can answer this question, the utilization by individuals in urban settings that have limited parks? That's kind of the first scenario, to access more of our national parks, and how do we make sure that's a diverse method? Second, when you think of, I remember we started a program in Anchorage when I was mayor, and I know the Interior Department has one. They have youth that kind of has a split of education and work programs in the summertime. Are those valuable programs that we should be expanding to what exists today to increase more youth participation, more generational use? Again, I guess is kind of, so it's a two-parter. One, how do you increase more urban utilization and / minority utilization of our current park system? And two, are the youth employment and parks program types of programs that go on in the summertime, are those showing value that we can actually point to and say, geez, if we had more of those, it would mean X? Anyone want to answer that?
Dr. Zarr, were you about to answer that?
Oh.
Okay, down to one. I think both of them are good questions. If I could preface your questions actually with a fact, which is that 70% of the world's population by 2030, which is only 14 years away, by the way, seems like so far away, being born in a few decades ago. So 70% of the world's population in 14 years will be living in an urban area. So that fact alone should scare the living daylights out of us. So we are living now in cities, and the relevance of parks, it isn't just about recreation anymore. It's important, and I'm a big fan of that. I've been to Yellowstone. I've been to some of the sort of the treasures of this country. But the truth is that most Americans have very little opportunity to do that on a daily basis. DC is unusual. We've got 13 national parks here, but most cities don't have national parks literally right outside their front door. So my neighborhood park, Stanton Park, is a national park. It's unusual. So, but my point is that it isn't about that once a year or once a lifetime trip. It's about every day, and you mentioned that. The frequency and also the way you think about it. So in public health, we talk about leisure and non-leisure exercise. All this isn't just about exercise, right? So the leisure is you're actually taking time out of your schedule to go and move. versus non-leisure, you got to go to work. You got to go to the Senate. You got to go shopping. You got to pick up your kid. There's things you have to do every day. So the question is, how do you tweak your schedule so that you can get maybe through some green space on the way? Because the data is there, the science is there that yes, you have improved cognitive outcomes, you have improved health outcomes, mental health outcomes by spending some more time in nature. I'll give you an example of 2 patients of mine, brothers. Over a span of 1 year, they should have come back and seen me every 3 months. Okay, they had obesity a year ago. They didn't come back for 1 year. They came back, both of them gained 20 pounds. I said, tell me what your routine is. And as you mentioned already, between 3 and 6, right? That's the aftercare part of it. I said, what do you do? The mother picks them up, which is unusual these days. Not the nanny, not somebody else, not walk home alone. The mother picks them up. I said, what do you do? We walk home. Where do you walk through? A park. Do you? Which park is it? We mapped it out. Right there in the room, real time, during the patient visit. And I said, is there anything stopping you from stopping in the park and letting the kids play for 20 minutes? She said, no. Would you do that? Sure. So we had a contract right there and then. I said, how about you tell me what days are good for you? The kids jumped at it like every day. And I'm like, well, let's not be overboard in our goals. And so I said, how about 3 days a week? Pick your 3 days. They said, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I said, sounds great. How long? What are you going to do there? So we talked about it, and I wrote that down in the chart. And I'm going to see them back in 1.5, 2 months from that visit, and we're going to monitor them over time. So it's about tweaking your daily routine, right, in the context of that patient, what they're willing to do and able to do and want to do, et cetera, and having the tool there in front of you so you can do that real time to connect people to nature. I hope that helps answers.
Terrific. I'd like to, our last question or comment from Mr. Kiernan.
Quick question, but let me preface it by saying extraordinary policies. Each of you have some very well thought out, exciting directions to move in each of your fields. Love them. Politics this day, in my mind, means good ideas don't necessarily win at the end of the day. Good policies, you gotta love them, but they may not succeed. I'd love to hear, what are you doing now that you might not have done 4 years ago, 8 years ago, within the political environment that we're now sitting, to get your good ideas heard, accepted, endorsed on both sides of the aisle? Politically, what are you doing? Great ideas. How are you changing how you sell them in the current challenging political environment?
Very briefly, from a travel and tourism industry perspective, at the state and at the federal level, you see a lot more engagement of the proverbial grassroots. And I know we talk about that a lot, but it is now the national agenda to drive grassroots activation. So for example, the U.S. Travel Association does what they call travel talks, and they're asking the tourism industry in a respective state or a congressional district to host a member of Congress, to give them kind of a back-of-the-house tour of a convention center or a park or some other tourism-related amenity within their district, and talk to them about the power of the travel and tourism industry specifically for their district. And then annually, the industry is convening here in D.C. for what is referred to as Destination Capitol Hill. So again, it is a grassroots, it is constituents that are on the Hill meeting with their members of Congress. And our message now is much broader, because it's not just about you need to care about tourism because of the jobs and the economic impact. It's also you need to care about the environment, you need to care about transportation, you need to care about education and health. And here's how the travel and tourism industry can benefit you as you contemplate those issues as well.
Tom, I think my own answer to that is it'd be very similar, which is finding alignment. Often the environment or caring about nature or caring about natural resources is seen as kind of this precious thing that, doesn't really relate to ongoing American society. But what we're talking about here is using nature saves billions of dollars in healthcare. So what happens is you can find this alignment between core values and the conservation values. So philosophically, that's how it works. But I used earlier the illustration of finding within Texas public policy, that's a tough place to do business. The idea that the Workforce Commission was looking for ways to improve daycare so that daycare would be affordable and be able to have healthier kids, and their parents could work as opposed to being on the welfare rolls. So that's a very conservative set of values that we were able to tap into and find a nature outcome to that. The other thing is that the Wildlife Federation, as an organization, taps into the hunter and angler community. And that's a very conservative community. Those are the Donald Trump people. And they seem to find in conservation, what they talk about in conservation, a normative sense of what's valuable in the world. So people in Arkansas, our members in Arkansas, our members in Alaska, are very supportive of these kind of broad-based conservation. When you shift it a little bit and you move it into endangered species, not so much. When you move it into climate change, not so much. But when you have sort of core conservation, there's a lot of alignment.
They love saving government money.
Yep.
Dr. Zarr, do you have a closing comment or reaction to the question?
Sure. I mean, I think I think some of the answers to the question were maybe alluded to earlier in this context of business. What does it mean for the economy? And because so much of our economy has been driven by illness, frankly, in my line of work, we're now seeing that change slowly. But I would remind everybody that whether you're Republican, Democrat, or wherever your political persuasion is, you need clean water and you need air, at the very least. And without those two things, in one day, you will perish. So it strikes a very sort of fundamental chord in all of us. And I think that, although we don't want to speak in those kinds of hyperbole all the time, sometimes you have to. We have programs that are part of the National Park RX movement all over the country, from Florida, Texas, up to the Northeast, to the Northwest. We have programs in the Midwest. So it resonates. And as I said earlier, everybody realizes, after a little bit of prodding, that they are lacking nature in their life. They may not understand that it actually impacts their personal health, but a little bit of dialogue goes a long way. So, I've personally been asked to speak at various venues, from places like this. I just went up to Connecticut and talked to a very large community health center and the park agencies there. Went up to New York and talked to the Nature Conservancy. All over the map, I've been talking about this, and it resonates, and people care. And it's not they just go away and say, what an interesting idea. They say, how do we start a Park RX program in our community? And that's what we're doing. We're helping people around the country develop their own Park RX programs.
Terrific. That's a great way to wrap up this session. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to our distinguished panel and committee. And Derek, you have some things to say, I believe.